In this scorched land, where the sun devours hope and dust chokes dreams, a mother and her children fight for survival. Each day is a battle. But what if a stranger, a wounded and mysterious cowboy, could change everything? Prepare for a story of courage, love, and redemption that proves that sometimes saving one life might just save your own. In the arid vastness of the Wild West, where the promise of life was as scarce as water, lived Mary and her two children. Lily, a 10-year-old girl with eyes that reflected the world's harshness. Food was rationed, water a precious luxury carried in heavy buckets from a nearly dry well miles away. Dignity was a luxury they could barely afford. Mary, with calloused hands and a face marked by time and pain, carried the weight of the world on her slender shoulders. She did her best to keep the flame of hope alive in her children's eyes, telling stories of a better time, of a future that seemed increasingly distant. And Tom, an 8-year-old boy who still held on to his innocence amidst their poverty. The small farm, more a ruin than a home, was all that remained after the tragedy that took their father. The cracked earth beneath their feet seemed to mirror their own hearts, dry, needy, but still resilient. Life was a daily struggle. The merciless sun burned skin and soul, making every planting an act of faith and every harvest a prayer. Their greatest enemy was not thirst or hunger, but the overwhelming loneliness. They were isolated, far from any town, and the few remaining neighbors were in similar straits. The problem wasn't just surviving today, but imagining a tomorrow. Without money, without resources, and with unproductive land, the future looked bleak. Every evening, as the sun painted the sky orange and purple, Mary gazed at the horizon, not in search of beauty, but for a sign, an answer to the question that haunted her. How would they go on? The farm was on the verge of collapse. Debts were accumulating, and the threat of losing the little they had was real and imminent. It was in this setting of fragility and despair that fate, treacherous and unpredictable, was about to intervene in a way Mary could never have imagined. Despair was a constant shadow, a whispering voice that tried to convince them to give up. But Mary was made of tougher stuff. She had promised her late husband that she would keep the family together, that she would protect her children, and that promise was her anchor in the storm. Lily, despite her young age, already showed a premature maturity. She helped her mother with chores, looked after her brother, and tried to hide her own fear so as not to burden Mary. Tom, on the other hand, still allowed himself to dream, finding solace in the drawings he made with sticks on the dusty ground, imagining worlds where food was abundant and water flowed freely. The scarcity of everything was the central conflict of their lives. It was a muggy late afternoon, the air heavy with suspended dust and heat that seemed to permeate every corner of the house. Mary was mending Tom's last few clothes, while Lily helped hang the small amount of washed laundry on the makeshift clothesline. Suddenly, a muffled sound and a heavy thud echoed from outside. Mary's heart froze. In that isolation, any strange noise was cause for alarm. It was rare for anyone to venture out that way, and when they did, they didn't always bring good intentions. With a kitchen knife in hand, Mary approached the door cautiously, her eyes searching for any sign of danger. Every sip of water he drank, every mouthful of food she forced him to swallow when he regained some consciousness, was one less resource for her and her children. The concern about the danger he might pose was constant. What if he was an outlaw? What if his problems followed them there? But, paradoxically, his presence also brought a small distraction, a different focus from the constant despair for survival. There was a mystery to unravel, a life to save. And deep down, Mary felt that maybe, just maybe, that decision could mean something more than just an act of kindness. What she saw made her stop. Lying in the dust, a few feet from the entrance, was a man. A cowboy, judging by his torn and dusty clothes, but unrecognizable, he was so badly wounded. The decision was quick and instinctive. Despite the scarcity of everything, despite the danger of sheltering a stranger, she knew she couldn't leave him there to die. With the help of the children, who, overcoming their initial fear, assisted her with more courage than Mary expected, they dragged him inside the house. It was an arduous task. The cowboy was big and heavy, and Mary's weakness was evident, but they managed. There was clotted blood on his shirt, a deep cut on his forehead, and an arm at an angle that indicated a serious fracture. His breathing was shallow and irregular. Lily ran to her mother, frightened, clinging to her skirt. Tom, a little more curious, peeked from behind Mary's legs. The instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to close the door, ignore the man, and protect her children. Mary did what she could. She cleaned his wounds with boiled water, used pieces of an old sheet as bandages, and improvised a splint for his broken arm. The fever ebbed and flowed in waves, and the man deliriously mumbled inaudible words. The nights were long, with Mary alternating between caring for the stranger and trying to ensure her children felt safe. Lily and Tom, curious and a little scared, watched the stranger closely, asking questions about who he was and where he came from. Mary had no answers. But something in the stranger's vulnerability, in the complete exhaustion of his body, stopped her. He seemed more a victim than a threat. "Stay here," Mary whispered to the children, and with a deep breath, she approached the man. He was unconscious. Mary touched his forehead, feverish. It was clear he needed urgent help. The first challenges came immediately. What to do with him? There were no medicines, not even proper bandages. The cowboy's presence added a new layer of difficulty to the family's already precarious existence. The cowboy's recovery was slow and painful, both for him and for Mary. Days turned into weeks. He had moments of lucidity and others of feverish delirium. The fever subsided, the pallor lessened, and his eyes, once dull, gained a spark of consciousness. It was then that he began to speak. His voice was hoarse, as if unused for a long time. He didn't reveal his name immediately, but fragments of his story began to emerge, mixed with pain and shame. He spoke of a past of power and decisions that led him to ruin. In Mary's house, even with poverty and scarcity, he found something that money could never buy: peace. And more, he found family. Lily and Tom, with their childish curiosity and uncomplicated affection, began to see him not as the wounded cowboy, but as a friend, a strong adult who was there. Tom, especially, began to attach himself to him, seeing in Ethan a father figure he had lost so early. Ethan, in turn, felt a protective instinct grow within him. The idea that his presence could put these precious lives at risk was unbearable. He mentioned shady dealings, lost bets, and a reputation for being a feared, ruthless man. Gratitude mixed with a burning desire to protect the family that had taken him in. He, the man who had always lived for himself, now felt responsible for others. Mary's decision to save him not only transformed their lives, but also began to transform his, in a slow and painful, but profound process. But the newfound peace was fragile. The shadow of his past was approaching, and they would soon be at a crossroads that would test the limits of their new and improbable family. He was a rich cowboy, yes, but his wealth had not protected him from the shadows that haunted him. Mary continued to care for him with an almost unbelievable dedication, barely sleeping and using the few resources they had. Lily and Tom, initially apprehensive, began to get used to the stranger's presence. Tom, in his innocence, even left small drawings next to his makeshift bed, while Lily watched with contained curiosity. Slowly, the man began to improve. Mary listened intently, without judgment. She saw the pain in his eyes, the guilt that seemed to consume him from within. And more than that, he revealed the origin of his problems, a dispute with former business partners who cheated him and hunted him, seeking revenge and the rest of his fortune. He was a marked man, with powerful enemies who would not give up until he was dead. He spoke of loneliness, of a life without affection, focused only on accumulating possessions and imposing his will. She had taken in a wanted man, a man with a dangerous past. Fear returned with force, mixed with a new layer of compassion. Why was he there? Why had he ended up at her doorstep? Ethan, seeing the terror in Mary's eyes, felt a new wave of remorse. He had put that family in danger. However, something in Mary's simplicity and kindness and the children's innocence began to touch a chord in his heart that he thought no longer existed. His voice showed remorse for past choices, for a path of destruction that led him to be shot and left to die in the desert. "I deserved it," he whispered one night, his voice choked. "I deserved to die there." The significant turning point happened when he finally revealed his name, Ethan. The revelation shocked Mary. He had never experienced the warmth of a home, someone's genuine concern. The shift in the story was clear. It wasn't just about Mary saving a man. It was about this man, Ethan, finding a new purpose. The brief reprieve in Mary and her children's lives brought by Ethan's recovery was short-lived. As the cowboy regained his strength, the tension in the air increased. The few travelers who passed by seemed to observe them more closely. She had made the decision to help him and didn't regret it. For her, kindness was a greater force than fear. But the concern for her children was constant. Lily, more perceptive, noticed the tension between her mother and Ethan. The henchman, surprised by the resistance, retreated, but not before leaving a clear warning. "They know where you are, cowboy, and they're coming for you and whoever you're protecting." The words echoed in the silence that followed, leaving a chilling sensation in the air. She overheard fragments of conversations about danger and revenge, and childish innocence began to give way to apprehension. The farm, once a refuge, was now a target. Mary and Ethan knew they had to make a decision: stay and fight, or try to escape to a safe place? The depth of Ethan's motivation to protect that family was evident. He had been reborn, and the price of his redemption would be to fight the shadows of his own past, with the hope of a future, perhaps, of peace. Tom, on the other hand, lived in his own world, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation, but sensing the change in the adult's mood. The sound of distant horses, once ignored, now sounded like a premonition. Ethan's internal struggle was palpable. He had found a refuge, a piece of paradise in the desolate land, and the genuine love Mary and the children offered him was something he had never known. But he also knew that this paradise could be destroyed by his presence. Guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't let his new family pay the price for his mistakes. He knew his enemies wouldn't be long in finding him. Whispers about a missing cowboy with a fortune were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before the clues led to that isolated farm. He was a tall man, with a low-brimmed hat that obscured his face, and an aura of menace that Ethan immediately recognized. He was one of his former partner's henchmen, and his presence there meant they had picked up his trail. Mary's heart froze. It was real. Danger was at their doorstep. Ethan, with his dark past and experience in the Wild West underworld, recognized the signs. Mary, sensing Ethan's growing anguish, tried to calm him. The tension escalated when, one late afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Ethan reacted quickly. He instructed Mary to take the children inside and not to come out under any circumstances. He grabbed the old carbine Mary kept for self-defense, a rifle he knew how to use better than anyone. The confrontation was imminent. Ethan's internal struggle was fierce. Protect the family, even if it meant confronting his past and perhaps losing the new life he had found. His motivation was clear. He was no longer the man who lived only for himself. Gratitude and love for Mary and the children had redefined his purpose. He was willing to sacrifice everything to protect them. The exchange of gunfire was quick and brutal. Ethan, despite his still sore arm, showed his old skill. The temporary victory brought minimal relief, but the consequences were clear. They were in danger. After the henchman's warning, the farm became a silent war camp. Ethan knew his old partners would come with full force. He had dealt with these men before. They were merciless and would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The rest of Ethan's fortune and his life as payment for his betrayal. Mary, with a courage she didn't even know she possessed, helped Ethan fortify the house. They used what they had: old planks to cover the windows, furniture to barricade the doors. The atmosphere was tense. Lily and Tom, now fully aware of the danger, clung to their mother, but also looked at Ethan with a mixture of fear and admiration. Silas was a cruel man, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a thirst for revenge that consumed him. "I'm not going anywhere, Silas." Mary watched with her heart in her throat. It was a suicidal risk, but Ethan couldn't fail. Ethan, driven by his new motivation, fought with a ferocity Silas didn't expect. He wasn't fighting for money, nor for revenge, but for the chance to have a life, a future, with the people who had rescued him. Ethan, wounded but alive, stumbled back to the house, where Mary and the children awaited him with tears in their eyes and an indescribable relief. Their fate had been sealed. They had fought together and survived. That intense and emotional moment marked not only the defeat of the enemies, but also the victory of a new family, forged in adversity and love. The scene was a whirlwind of dust, sweat, and blood. He had to protect the family that had saved him. With the gun pointed at his tormentor's face, he hesitated. The old Ethan would have pulled the trigger without thinking. But the new Ethan, the man who had found peace and love, couldn't do it. He would turn him over to justice. But Silas, in a last act of desperation, pulled a hidden knife. Lily, who had come out of the house to see her adopted father fight, saw the movement and screamed, her cry echoing through the air. Ethan, alerted, managed to dodge at the last second, but the knife grazed him. The pain was sharp, but the threat had been neutralized. Silas's other men, seeing their leader defeated, fled into the desert. "This is my home now, and no one's going to touch this family." Ethan's response surprised Silas, who expected a broken, solitary man. He had changed. "Ethan," he shouted, his voice cutting through the air. "Come out, or we'll make this little house your grave and these innocent people's." He was their only hope. Ethan knew that if the fire spread, the house would be consumed. He had to make a quick decision. He had to leave the protection of the house and confront Silas directly. Night fell, dark and cold. The howling winds seemed to carry the echoes of approaching riders. Ethan was on the makeshift roof, carbine in hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Mary was inside with the children, ready for whatever came. It was then that they heard the sound. First, a distant trot, then the gallop of multiple horses. It was them. The enemies, led by Silas, Ethan's former partner, approached the farm like ravenous shadows. Ethan didn't hesitate. The shootout began. Ethan, with precise aim, managed to take down some of Silas's men, but they were too many. Bullets slammed into the house walls, sending dust flying. Inside, Mary hugged the children, trying to shield them from the noise and terror. Lily cried, but Tom, strangely, seemed focused, clutching a small amulet Ethan had given him. The climax arrived when Silas, in a daring move, tried to set the barn on fire. In a desperate act of bravery, Ethan jumped from the roof, running towards the barn, while Silas and his men focused their fire on him. The final confrontation between Ethan and Silas was brutal. They faced each other hand to hand, punches and kicks in a desperate fight for survival. In a decisive moment, Ethan managed to disarm Silas, throwing him to the ground. The dust settled. The dawn that followed the confrontation was the most beautiful Mary had ever seen. The dust of battle settled, revealing a sky stained with gold and rose. The enemies had fled, and peace, for the first time in a long time, seemed real and lasting. Ethan, wounded but determined, began to recover again, this time with a sense of triumph and a renewed purpose. The threat had been neutralized, and justice, in its own way, had been served. Ethan made sure Silas was handed over to the authorities, finally ending the cycle of violence. To find redemption amidst the ruins and to build a new home where love flourishes even in the driest desert. It was a reflection on how a single act of compassion can trigger a chain of events that not only saves a life, but completely redefines the course of many others. And in a world where hope was a scarce resource, Mary and Ethan proved that sometimes the greatest wealth is not in what you have, but in what you give. With the departure of the enemies and Ethan's recovery, life on the farm began to change drastically. Ethan, the rich cowboy who had lost everything, still had some hidden resources, a fruit of his prosperous times, now disconnected from his illicit activities. With these resources and his vast knowledge of land management and business, he began to invest in Mary's farm. Their partnership was more than a collaboration. It was a bond of respect, admiration, and, above all, love. Ethan, who had never known the meaning of family, found in Mary and the children what had always been missing in his life. He was a protector, a mentor, and, for Lily and Tom, a father figure they barely dared to dream of. He taught them about the land, about animals, about life, and in return, they taught him about unconditional love and joy in the small things. The lands, once dry and barren, began to flourish under his guidance. He brought water from deeper wells, implemented new cultivation techniques, and gradually, the farm, which was once an image of despair, began to transform into an oasis of hope. The internal and external conflicts had been resolved, and Mary's actions, in saving a stranger in despair, had transformed their lives in a way she could never have imagined. Poverty had been replaced by prosperity, loneliness by unity, and despair by hope. Food was abundant, and water, a precious commodity, was no longer a constant concern. The dignity that had been taken from Mary and her children was being restored, and the promise of a better future became a reality with each passing day. Mary, once overwhelmed, now shared the burden of the farm with Ethan. The family, now complete, was a testament to the power of kindness and redemption. The story of Mary and Ethan was not just about a rich cowboy saved by a poor widow. It was about the human capacity to transform